All right. So just tell me when I'm live. I'm live. Okay, great. Okay, well, hello everybody, and welcome for joining today on May the 4th. May the 4th be with you. I had to say that, otherwise I would kick myself, and because it's also my nephew's birthday as well, and he's very lucky to be born on today, and hopefully he does grow up to enjoy Star Wars, because that would be a waste of time. Anyway, so today we are going to be joined by Patrick Forscher, and we're very thrilled to have him because he's beaming in through Nairobi at the moment, and hopefully his internet won't crash out, but we decided to go mute on his camera just so that we can make sure we can maximize the bandwidth. So that's why you probably won't be able to see him, but you will see his slides and you will hear his lovely stateside voice. But before I do that, I will just quickly go through a few announcements. So if you check out our Twitter feed, you will see that we have lots of talks coming up this semester, so please check those out. You can see them on at RIOT Science Club for the main site. A few things for the live events, so you can enter your questions in on your right hand side of the screen. If you join in late, you can pause and rewind as well, so you don't need to wait until the feed is finished. You can just do it in real time. And I will go through the questions at the end and feed them to Patrick. So on to Patrick. So I'll just do a quick bio, which I have pilfered from this website, which has been handily give me a nice summary of sort of Patrick's CV, if you like. So as Patrick will go through today, he is a research lead at the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, which is headquartered in Nairobi, Kenya, and it's focused on using behavioral science in service of alleviating poverty. Before that, he was based at the Universitat Grenoble Alps as a research scientist, and he has also been a funding lead for the Psych-Sci Accelerator, or the Psychological Science Accelerator. And before that, or in parallel to that, he's also done lots of work looking at unconscious or implicit bias as well. And we could have invited him for any one of those really interesting areas of his research career, but we really want to learn about what we think is going to be a characteristic of, hopefully, characteristic of the discussions moving forward in the open science world, which is sort of how to broaden the conversation to outside, I guess, this sort of weird or westernized sort of focus on scientific and research production and generation and idea generation. So with no more ado, I'm going to hand the keys over to you now, Patrick, so you can unmute, and I will just mute my camera and mic, and just to say thank you so much again for joining us.
All right, so I'm Patrick Forscher. Currently, I'm a research lead at the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics. This is a behavioral science research center headquartered in Nairobi, where I'm actually calling in from. And so we do all sorts of behavioral science, but mostly focused on applied research questions, especially alleviating poverty. Before this, I was a research lead, or rather a funding lead, for an organization called the Psychological Science Accelerator, which will feature in my talk. And I was also a researcher at Universitat Grenoble Alps. And before that, actually, I was an assistant professor at the University of Arkansas. So I made a sideways career move, which worked out great for me, actually. I'm very happy with my current position. And the topic I'll be talking about is about research capacity. And you can see I'm making the argument that's in the title of the slide, that science should value capacity building. And what I mean by capacity, research capacity, is instead of the science, the product, it's the stuff that makes the science happen. And I'm going to have a sort of multi-stage process to advance that argument that sort of charts my own personal trajectory through the different positions that I've been in. My interest in this topic came from my involvement in an organization called the Society for the Improvement of Psychological Science. If you haven't heard of it before, it's a special sort of scientific society that, instead of focusing on talking, focuses on action. So in addition, there is some talking that happens at SIPS meetings. But in addition to that, there's a real focus on identifying concrete problems and figuring out steps to address them. So a typical conference hosted by SIPS might go like this. You get a bunch of people into a room, and you might have already agreed that there's some sort of problem, like open science isn't valued enough in job descriptions or something like that. And or you might not have agreed on precisely what the problem is. So you figure out together to how to define the problem space in a way that allows you to do something about it. Then you figure out the low-hanging fruit, as it were, to try to solve that problem, and you take specific actions to address it. So you write job ads or job ad language that you give to other people or whatever. I love this meeting, and I've been to several of them. And over time, I noticed there were certain projects that really had legs that sustained themselves after the SIPS meeting was over, and there are certain projects that didn't. So some of the projects that had legs are things like SciArchive. This is a preprint server for psychology. It was, I believe, established at the first SIPS meeting. And this is a project that I think has been enormously impactful. I would venture to guess that if you regularly read psychology research, you've probably read a preprint that was posted on SciArchive. So this is definitely a project that had legs. Another one, which I will talk about in more detail later in the talk, is the Psychological Science Accelerator. It does projects that I like to call big team science. They're big distributed projects that bring together people with different skills from different places to do projects that would be harder if any one person was doing them alone. And this is another project that I think if you interface with psychology in some way, you probably have heard of it, if only because the projects that it does are so big, which makes them kind of eye-catching. These were projects that I think I'm pretty confident in saying they've been quite impactful on psychology. They've solved concrete problems for psychology. But there are other projects that also were targeting specific problems that were important that just kind of tailed off. These are things like, in one of my early meetings, I and a group of other people worked together to try to create this open access journal that was very prestigious. It was aiming for something like Psychological Science, the journal, on that level, and that valued quality. And at the same time, we were trying to solve problems like not having good a lot of nice ideas, as far as I know. And it was hard to figure out why. Why did that project stall? Another one that I spent quite a bit of time working on is it was trying to create this standard psychology data scheme. And if you're not as in the weeds in like data structure and technical stuff, frankly, I'm not, but I worked on this, so I have some understanding of what we were trying to accomplish. What this would enable is, imagine you had some sort of program that trawled the open science framework where a lot of people put their data sets. And that program knows exactly, if it encounters a data set, where the data are located, where the variable names are located, and where the metadata are located. That would enable push button meta-analysis, for example, which would be an amazing product. And the reason I know this is that that exists for a data scheme called BIDS. BIDS is a data scheme for neuroimaging data, and BIDS has enabled push button meta-analysis. So this is a great idea. We have a draft schema, but that project stalled. Nothing on the people involved, but it hasn't gone anywhere concrete. So I looked at these sustained projects and stalled projects, and I wondered why are some projects stalling, even if they're a good idea that solves a concrete problem. I thought about this for a long time, and I think by now I have the beginnings of an answer. And my answer comes from my career experiences working for the Psychological Science Accelerator, which I've already mentioned, and the Busara Center for Behavioral Economics, which is my current place of employment. And in both these roles, a big part of my job was to get resources. For the Psychological Science Accelerator, I was the funding lead. So this was one of my biggest responsibilities, and I was probably the person who was spending the most time on it. For the Busara Center, I have a responsibility to gather resources to sustain my team. So I spend a lot of time finding those resources and marshaling them and making sure people get the money needed to do what we're all aiming to do. And these experiences have given me a taste of some of the difficulties, constraints, and the general landscape of funding. Particularly science funding, as it applies to projects kind of like the ones that come out of SIFs, ones that aim to improve science in some way by creating some sort of infrastructure or tool or set of tools that allows something to happen in science that couldn't happen before. And it's led me to a couple conclusions. First, the reason that not all projects succeed, even the ones that are solving a particular problem and have energy behind them, is that the science funding landscape is a warped and twisted place that constrains what is possible for organizations and makes it very hard to navigate. It's very hard to sustain organizations in the current science funding landscape. And in particular, the funding landscape undervalues research capacity and infrastructure. A lot of the things that SIPS projects are trying to do is enable good science to happen rather than do science itself. And that's something that the current funding landscape, the current science funding landscape is really bad at. And the last conclusion is that the landscape is warped in a way that I think is unethical, that wastes resources, and that creates organizational vulnerabilities for the organizations that do manage to navigate it. So, to go back to the reason that many SIPS projects don't have legs, especially the ones that are creating tools or organizations or whatever, is that that's just a very hard thing to do. It's very hard to sustain organizations that are aimed at building research capacity. So what I'm going to do in the rest of the talk is walk you through how I came to these conclusions. And the rest of the talk is going to have three parts. The first is I'm going to talk about some particular aspects of the funding landscape. It's not everything, but there are certain aspects that I think are important to highlight in order to make the argument that I want to make. And in the next two parts, I'm going to walk you through my experiences and a bit of the ins and outs of the PSA and the Busara Center. And over the course of those two little mini case studies, I hope to bring you on the journey that I went that brought me to the conclusions that I drew in the previous slide. So the first point that I want to make about the science funding landscape is that it's extremely resource intensive. It's very costly. The way that we've chosen, we collectively have chosen to allocate science or allocate money for science is quite labor intensive and costly in terms of money. There's a variety of evidence I could draw on to advance this argument, but I'll draw on two papers. One is a time use study with faculty in the US, science and engineering faculty. What this paper was trying to do was just get an estimate of the amount of time per week that people spend on various tasks. And one of the top line findings is that in the US, science and engineering faculty spent 4 hours per week preparing applications for funding. Remember, when you're preparing an application, what you're doing is making the argument to do your research, not actually doing the research. So this is 10% of time spent just making arguments to do research. That's a fair amount, I would say, especially when you consider, for example, that most institutions, faculty, at most research institutions, faculty spend 50% of time on research. This is fully a fifth of that time spent to arguing to do the research. Another place that I could draw from to advance this argument is this paper out of Australia. This one estimates that one single call to the major granting system or funder cost 400 years of research time at a cost of 226 million euros. That is a lot of money, and that is a lot of time. So one point I want to make here is that if we're spending so much money just on the system that determines how we allocate money, we would want something out of that money spent. We would want that system to work well. We especially would not want it to have unintended negative consequences for the conduct of research. Second point that I want to make is about the actual priorities that funders have as determined through their calls for proposals. So most science uses a competitive, usually peer review system where funders talk about their priorities and the criteria for evaluation and in calls for proposals, and people submit proposals to those calls. And you can look at the criteria that are laid out to get a sense of what funders want. So one thing that many science funders want is talented individual scientists. This is text from a call from the European Research Council. It's their starting grant mechanism. And they say that they want some specifically talented researchers who have already produced excellent work and are ready to work independently. Basically, they want to bet on winners. They're not betting on potential, they're betting on accomplishments. And they specifically say they want individuals. So that's one thing. Excellent individual principal investigators. Second thing that funders say they want is specific projects. So this is a call from the US National Institutes of Health. It's for their major granting mechanism, which is called the R01. And this text says specifically they want discrete projects that are specified and circumscribed. They're projects that have a specific beginning, middle, and end, and the end is at the end of the funding. And the last thing that these calls often say is that they want to solve a specific problem as determined by the priorities of the funder. So this is a call from a foundation called the Lacuna Fund. They say that they want some labeled data sets to address underserved populations on a specific problem. This is even a little bit general for this kind of call for proposals. Sometimes they're very, very specific. So it could be, some funder has noticed that there's a big problem with anemia and new mothers in India. And they want specifically to increase iron supplementation among the new mothers. So they might even give you a sketch of the solution, but what they're asking is for a bunch of people to submit bids that say, this is the way that we're going to get to that solution. This is how we're going to implement it. They can be that specific, not always, but often. And the important point here is that, again, the priority is dictated by the funder, but you as the scientist or implementer or whoever are saying how you plan to get there. So there are three categories of things. There are excellent, often individual scientists. They are specific projects, and in this call it says even they're specific projects that fit with the mission of the National Institutes of Health, or they're ways to solve specific problems that are dictated by the priorities of the case studies. Okay, let's talk about the Psychological Science Accelerator. I already mentioned a little bit what the PSA is trying to do. It's so the motivation behind the PSA is, and I know about this because I was one of the founding members actually, is that there are two common problems in psychological science. One is a lot of studies are based on samples that are too small, so you can't make definitive claims based on those small samples. Another one is that many of the samples are based in the United States and Europe. And so a bunch of us, not just me, but the founder, the person who gets the most credit is Chris Chartier. But we all said, well, there are a bunch of research labs in psychology that are distributed throughout the world. Maybe we can solve both of these problems by coming together, working on common protocols, and sending those protocols out to a bunch of different labs all over the world. So what we get by doing that is much larger samples than are easily attainable by a single lab, labs that are distributed in space in different countries. Oh, by the way, you also get access to new skills and expertise from all of the excellent members who join the PSA. When I describe the basic motivation for the PSA to most people, they say, hey, that sounds like a great idea. I mean, that's great. And in fact, the PSA has been, the idea of it anyway, has really caught the imaginations of a lot of people. In one of our surveys of membership, we counted 1,400 scientists who would count themselves as members of the PSA from 171 countries. So this, in principle, seems like a good idea. The projects that the PSA does are really quite big. And to give you a sense of the scale, I'll give you the example of our first empirical project. This was on a model of face perception, or the inferences that people make from faces. And the data set from this project spanned 11 world regions, 41 countries, and almost 12,000 participants. And if you look at other projects that the PSA has done, they're similar in scale, if not bigger. One recent one, which was on a way to change or manage emotions, had a data set from about 20,000 people. And if I remember right, the author list was something like 460. So these can really be quite big projects. And that shows the level of aspiration for what PSA projects, or what we want PSA projects to be. Another important point is that the projects are chosen democratically. The reasoning here goes that if a bunch of people are going to spend their limited resources to do a specific project, we should make sure that they have a say in the content of that project. So the way PSA projects are typically selected is there's a call for proposals, kind of like, a grant call, or maybe a special issue of a journal. There's an evaluation process, and as part of that evaluation process, members get to vote on the projects that they like. I'm showing you a little bit of the evaluation criteria. The main important point here is that there's this emphasis on democratic selection. The last important point of background about the PSA is that its values are really quite lofty and aspirational. At the moment of the PSA's founding, we had a bunch of conversations about what we want these values to be. So these were also selected a bit democratically, and they're all good things. So I'm showing you them. They're things like diversity and inclusion, research rigor, democratic decision-making, which I already mentioned, openness to criticism, transparency. These are all good things in science. I think they would be difficult things to argue against. And the PSA means it. These are meant to guide the projects that are aspirational. So I've mentioned how PSA projects are big. There's this aspiration of democratic control. And so we also have these lofty values to guide the activities that we do. My role in the PSA, or one of my primary roles, was to ensure that we had the resources to get the stuff done to actually accomplish these projects, fulfill our values, and so on. How did that work? How did we manage to marshal those resources? Well, one thing that we did is kind of the obvious thing in science. If you figure out that you need resources to do some kind of project, you write a grant proposal that you submit for competitive peer review. And we did a bunch of that. And this is about how it went, or at least it's emblematic of how it went. So I wasn't the only person who wrote these proposals. Charlie Ebersole is another person. And one of the comments that we got on a proposal that he submitted was that the reviewer said, well, obviously the PSA is doing all of these great activities without any resources. So why is it worth spending resources on the PSA in the first place? Not a very fair comment. We got this and other ones that were, to my view, as an interested viewer on this, unfair. But if I reflect back a bit on the values that the PSA has in its mission and the sorts of things that many science funders say that they want, to me, I can understand how this comment came about. The reason is that I mentioned funders want things like individual stellar PIs. Well, the whole point of the PSA really is to band together to do collaborative projects rather than emphasizing an individual stellar PI. So that's a major clash. Funders also say that they want discrete projects that have a beginning, middle, and end. Well, what we wanted really is not to do any one particular project, but to help build up the PSA, to make this idea in our minds a legit organization with things like, HR and management and, all the somewhat, or what scientists often think are boring things, but skilled things that are needed to make an organization an organization. And, the final thing that funders say that they want is projects within their priorities. Well, I just mentioned how the PSA has this aspiration of democratic control. We want to be able to, we meaning the collective we, all of the PSA members, we want to be able to control that the projects that we do. But the funders, when they give out their calls, are telling you what they want you to do. So that's a big clash between this aspiration of democratic control and the fact that funders want to find people to do the things that they think are important. So in effect, the way the PSA has done all of this lofty work is through volunteerism. Instead of having the money to pay for things, we've had volunteers that basically take on a side job to get these things done. Before I get into the next point, I just want to highlight a certain aspect of the way academic work is typically structured, at least in research-oriented institutions in the United States and Europe. So many faculty have scope to take on projects that they think are important. And the way that happens is they're teaching for, say, 50% of their time or some percentage of their time. And effectively, there's this bargain where the time spent teaching buys out the time that you do research. Of course, the other way to buy out your research time is to actually write grants, but there is this bargain where that faculty have with the universities, where if you don't have a grant, well, often your teaching time will buy out some of your research time anyway. But that bargain is only present in certain institutions. Many of them are European and North American, and they're research active institutions. So if you're at a teaching college, you might not have this bargain. You might be expected to do research anyway, but you might not have the time effectively bought out to do it. So the people who have the time to spend on, mostly volunteer projects are the people whose time is bought out. And the other important point is that these research active institutions, the institutions that have money to spend or the resources to support research activity are mostly in North America and Europe. If you're in Kenya, for example, a lot of your incentives are to do teaching because that's what your administration rewards. And oh, by the way, you're also often not given any research budget. So if you want to do projects, you're either on your own to find a funder or you spend money out of pocket. And this is something that happens. So that leaves the people who are able to dedicate some of their time to volunteers are going to be at those research active institutions. And that is something that we see in PSA membership. So this is a map that shows where PSA members are located. You're seeing a lot of green in North America and Europe, and that reflects the state of research infrastructure and research funding in those countries and globally. We've actually done a survey or audit of membership, and we estimate that about 2/3 of PSA members are located in countries that you might classify as the global north, that is mostly North America and Europe. There's another dimension to who is likely to spend time volunteering. And that point ties back to something that Charlie said in his comments about the comments that we got on our funding applications. And that's that a lot of the volunteers are people who are somewhat idealistic. They want to make a change. They see problems in the current system. They're often early career researchers, frankly. And there's this kind of weird dynamic where if you're an early career researcher and you want to continue on in traditional academia, a lot of what traditional academia rewards is first author publications, your own science. And if you're spending time working on sort of infrastructure projects that are a bit aspirational, like the PSA, that's time that you're not spending on your own research, which might mean that you end up not having the traditional criteria to advance in academia. Now you might advance in other places. That's something that I did. I'm not in traditional academia anymore. But this is a bit of a perverse system. And I would argue there's a bit of an ethical, there's a bit of an ethical problem here. This is quite unfair to the people who both want to spend their limited time on projects to make the research ecosystem better and who have aspirations of continuing on in academia. Another complication with the volunteer model or constraint is that some roles within the PSA are easier to volunteer for than others. And I'll give you an example of one of the, I would argue, most important roles in PSA projects, which is we call it the project monitor. It's essentially a project manager, or it's what I recognize as a project manager now that I'm working at a nonprofit that has project managers. The reason this role is so important is that the PSA is essentially acting as a coordinator between many different people who are scattered throughout the globe. Someone needs to do that coordination to ensure that people do the things that they say that they're going to do on an appropriate timeline, using the appropriate protocol, and within the other project constraints. Project monitors are a big role, a very skilled role too. And despite what I said about academics not liking management, this is a management job that I think can be quite interesting, but it asks a lot of you. So here are some of the things that you need to do as a project monitor for the PSA. You're coordinating between 50 plus team members. I mentioned we had a project that had 460-some team members. You're sitting in on meetings and coordinating with the rest of this committee that we have for project monitors, assisting with the strategy for implementing the study, ensuring that project materials are well documented, ensuring that project team members are credited for the things that they're supposed to do. You're keeping the project on schedule, and these are very complicated projects. You might be coordinating with members of the translation team who speak different languages, and so on. It's a very skill-intensive role. And the thing that you get, at least if you want to continue on in traditional academia, is one, project management skills, which I would argue are undervalued in academia, but they are not valued. You get connections. So you get to interact with a lot of smart people. I think that's worth a lot. And you get place number 4, maybe on a 50 plus author paper. So, and under the current system of academic credit, the first author usually gets the bulk of the credit. And you end up doing like a lot of work for not a lot of traditional credit as it's traditionally conceived in academia. So this is a role that is super important, but the cost-benefit ratio, I don't know, it's hard to see it unless you're getting something else out of being a project monitor, which is maybe the idea of contributing to improving psychological science. It's a very idealistic thing. I don't know. I don't know if this is a cost-benefit ratio that can sustain itself over the long haul. The final thing that I noticed in my role as the funding lead in the PSA is that there are some hidden constraints that are imposed by the way resources are structured on the things that the PSA wants to do. Scientists often, in my experience anyway, don't like to think about finances and resources and so forth. But we live in a resource-constrained world, and those resources always impose some constraints. And those constraints are extremely important when you're dealing with an organization that doesn't have core funding for itself. The way I have put it in the past to drive this point home is that there are different ways that the PSA could structure itself that either are a little bit minimalistic, meaning we're limiting the PSA's aspirations within a constrained set of resources, or there's a more maximal version of the PSA that does a lot. The minimal version is the PSA could just be a mailing list. In other words, it can be a place for individual PIs to recruit collaborators to do their projects. All you need for that is a system of communication. You don't need a lot. You could just have a listserv, you could have a forum, whatever. You create a very minimal bit of technology to allow some communication and coordination, and that's it. That could be the PSA. On the other hand, we have the maximal version, which comes closer to the PSA's original vision of itself, where the PSA is this active organization that ensures high quality projects, that implements the projects up to a high standard, that fulfills a bunch of other values, and is generally being active to improve psychological science and do good things in psychology. The minimal version is the less costly version of the PSA. The maximal version is more costly, whether you're thinking of cost in terms of labor, finances, whatever. The maximal version requires more. And this is the way that resources constrain what is available to the PSA. Another way to think about this is to go back to those lofty values that I mentioned that the PSA holds for itself. You know, there are things like diversity and inclusion, democratic decision-making, and so on. In order to live out those values, you can think of like specific activities that would allow the value to be instantiated in some way within the PSA. I'll give a few of these. To get leadership, diversity and inclusion, you could actively recruit leadership from outside North America and Europe. Well, someone has to do that recruitment. You could give grants to labs in regions without a lot of resources to allow them to join specific projects. That requires money. For democratic decision-making, you could implement fast and fair elections, but someone has to administer those elections. For transparency, you could curate the data sets and methods, but someone has to do that curation. Ditto with reproducible code. For rigor, you could do power analyses, but someone has to have the skills to do that. You could have good measurement practices, but you need to have a measurement expert at your disposal who is willing and able to give advice. For openness to criticism, you could have leadership who actively responds to criticism, but the leadership has to have bandwidth to do that. My point here is that to fulfill the activities required to live out the values within the PSA, you need resources to do it. And that ties back to the structure of funding that I mentioned, where funders are looking for things like stellar PIs and specific projects that just don't mesh well with the PSA, which is built intentionally to do something new and different within the scientific ecosystem. There's a bit of a silver lining to this story, and that is that the PSA was able to secure a grant that pays for some of the nice stuff that I was talking about. It's a grant from the Templeton Foundation, and it's designed to, or the intent of the grant is to do projects that fit the Templeton funding priorities, which are about things like living the good life, the science of religion, and so on. There's a catch here, though. The funding in this grant is tied to a specific project, so it's a little bit hard to figure out, you know, how are we paying for things like, you know, fast and fair elections when the money is supposed to go to doing Templeton-funded studies? There might be a way to do it, but there's definitely a tension there. This is also only one grant, so what happens when the grant expires? Is the grant even sufficient to do all the things that the PSA is supposed to do? And the last thing is, it's tied to the Templeton strategic priorities. This is the way that we were able to pitch the grant, is that it's helping advance Templeton priorities, which gives up some of that democratic control that I said was important in the PSA's founding. So there's still this tension, this unresolved tension between the PSA's aspirations for itself and the constraints imposed by the funding landscape. So much for the PSA. In my next study, or in my next case study, I'm going to talk about the Busara Center, or at least you know, what I've learned about it in my time at the Busara Center. And I'll highlight some similar themes along the way. So the Busara Center is a research center headquartered in Nairobi, where I'm calling from. And it's structured as a nonprofit, so I'm not working at a university currently. The Busara Center's mission is to do behavioral science in service of poverty alleviation We've done more than 377 projects located in the Global South. We have a lot of experience with that. And the Busara Center is trying to build up some infrastructure in the Global South to ensure that science can be led by people located in the Global South. So one thing I want to highlight here, the Busara Center is also a sort of aspirational nonprofit that's trying to do something different, that's emphasizing, that has a certain set of priorities that it tries to live out in its work, similar to the Psychological Science Accelerator. The projects that the Busara Center does are quite varied. So some are really focused on implementation, and while they might be informed by science, they are not science per se. So to give you an example of that, we did this report in Tanzania on the digital credit landscape on behalf of the central bank in Tanzania and a couple other funders or partners. And this report was pretty influential and has led to, shifts in how the Tanzanian central bank manages its projects. So very implementation focused. That's focused on a specific policy landscape. And it might be informed by science, but it's not a typical scientific activity. Some of the projects that we do look like more, academically inclined research, but we might be hired to do this by, scientists who are located at universities. So here's one example of this. This was a project on the impact of cash transfers and psychotherapy on well-being in Kenya. One of the interesting findings from this is that cash did a lot to enhance well-being and psychotherapy did not much at all. Even cash plus psychotherapy did as much as cash did alone. So interesting project. Important point here, it's we're sort of hired to do a project that fits a specific PI's vision. We might have inputs on the design, but the impetus of the project is the PI who pays us money to help implement it. Some of what we do is more traditional research, and it's done because we want to do it. Just to highlight here, my job actually, or a major part of my job at the Busara Center, is to lead this internal research agenda. So this is a picture of me and my brilliant team. This is the focus of our team, is to do the research that we want to do. So we have a mix of very implementation focused projects, often, almost always done at the behest of funders. It's that problem solving type of research or funding call that I mentioned before. Some is research done at the behest of others, and some is research done because we want to do it. Most of our projects are done for a client in the terminology we use in the Busara Center. This often is research in that problem-solving mold, although sometimes we're hired by academics, as I mentioned before. And there's a very specific reason for this that is tied to the structure of funding. And to give you a sense of why this happens, I'll give you a little bit of insight into our internally projected success rates for different kinds of calls for proposals. One is open competition. This is that competitive peer review process that I mentioned before. That's often done at like the European Research Council, the National Science Foundation in the United States, the National Institutes of Health, and so on. Most of the science that these institutes fund is done through an open competition. Our projected internal success rates, which we set based on our experience with these kinds of bids, is 2%. Whereas if you work more and more closely with a client, our success rate goes up because we are working with a specific client who has us in mind, who has an ongoing relationship with us. Our internal projected success rate for what we call a single source bid which means a client comes to us and says, hey, will you do this project with me? And we say yes, is 15%. So if you're like a decision maker within Busara, put your think from our perspective. Would you rather be submitting a bunch of open competition bids with a projected success rate based on experience of 2%, or those single source bids? If you're taking care of the bottom line, you're looking at those single source bids. The catch is that many of our clients are global North funders. You know, this is people like the National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, and a few others that you may not be as familiar with if you're mostly a scientist rather than working on implementation as well. There are people like Gates, UNICEF, yes, Templeton. We have worked with Templeton in the past. Innovations for Poverty Action, which does not originate grants, but does act as sort of a third party that administers grants. And yeah, individual academics, we have those clients as well. All of these clients have their own priorities, and they're made quite explicit. Gates, Templeton, these have a specific mission that they want to see fulfilled. And sometimes they have some ideas on how to fulfill it, as I mentioned in my section on granting. Even individual academics, they have their own ideas about the projects that they want to do. And they usually come to us because they want to do a specific project with us because they think we can make it happen. So point being, these clients have certain things that they want to do, and even sometimes ideas about how that thing is done. The Busara Center, I mentioned it has this emphasis on alleviating poverty, especially in the global south. So we have certain people who are supposed to be beneficiaries of our activities, meaning our activities help them. And the thing is, there's a big difference in outlook, in culture, in income, socioeconomic status between our clients, who are mostly in the global north, and our beneficiaries who are, say, in Nairobi. There's essentially this wall that separates the worldview, priorities, and so forth between clients and beneficiaries. And that wall is, and this particular funding model that relies on clients creates one of the risks that I want to describe for projects that happen both in Busara, but also in other similar organizations, and that is neocolonialism. So you have this set of beneficiaries, or intended beneficiaries, a set of decision makers, clients who are setting the priorities, and this gap that separates the worlds of the two. Often the beneficiaries are participating in some sort of research project, and they spend labor and time to work on that project. The labor produces data, evidence, which is turned into knowledge that goes to the funders or the clients. Now, before I get to the next part, I just want to ask, a lot of you are the listeners to this talk are academics who are doing research of their own. So when is the last time that you completed a research project, and once you were done with you generated the findings, you actually shared them with your research participants? I'm just going to take a guess here and say this very rarely happens, if at all. I know when I was working at universities, I didn't do this, but this is something that in the context of a place like the Busara Center creates this neo-colonial dynamic where a certain set of people who live in the global south, they might be Black, for example, are spending their scarce time and labor producing data that is turned into knowledge that stays in the hands of the decision makers who live in the global south. So without this feedback loop, that's where there's some sort of benefit, especially, benefit in terms of new knowledge that goes back to the people who spend the labor. This looks very much like an extractive regime that we might have seen during the, 1850s through 1950s, 1960s. Another risk that this funding structure creates is that of social harm. So, the risk is tied back to that divide in worldview that I mentioned between the people who are calling a lot of the shots and the people who are participating in the research. And that's that because the people who are making the decisions are often not familiar with the context of the people who are participating in the research, the structure of the research might end up creating harms that are not easily foreseeable because of that gap in worldview, at least if you don't take steps to protect against it. I'll give a couple examples of this because it might be hard to understand without something concrete to tie this to. So this example I'm going to give is from a cash transfer RCT. So what's happening here is people are randomly assigned to receive money or not, and you're assessing the impact of that money on some sort of outcome, in this case, HIV prevention. These cash transfer randomized controlled trials are pretty interesting because they're definitely targeted at doing good. And if you just sort of, if you're not deeply immersed in the context of these studies, like giving people money just seems like a unilateral good. Like it's just good to give people money, especially if they're poor. So this is a weird context if you're not familiar with the landscape in which to talk about social harm. And yet, social harm can happen in the context of these studies. For example, one of the harms in this study in South Africa was that, so a bunch of girls were given money to, try to buy birth control and other things. They decided how to spend the money with the ultimate aim of preventing the spread of HIV. Well, in this study, a lot of the men who were not receiving the cash because they were men and outside of the exclusion criteria got a bit jealous of the women who were receiving the cash. And they started spreading rumors that the girls who received the grant were HIV positive, prostitutes, they were pregnant, that these girls had been deliberately infected by AIDS, or that they were essentially grooming these girls to become prostitutes. These are pretty bad outcomes for the girls and women who were in the study. And, maybe the outcomes were promoted by jealousy, or maybe it was all on the men. But I can't help but think that if there was maybe a bit more effort to connect with the community, to get them to understand the aims of the study, why it was designed the way it was, why the inclusion and exclusion criteria were the way they were, that these kinds of rumors at least would have been less likely to circulate. Here's another example. So this is another cash transfer RCT. Again, the outcome is the ultimate outcome that they want to impact is HIV prevention. The context here is Kenya. And in this study, some of the comments that people made about the cash that they received were, for example, they thought, well, maybe the Illuminati are controlling the outcomes or something, which might seem like a weird comment to make, but take a step back here. So imagine that you live in Kenya. You're not familiar with research. It's just not part of your context. Maybe there are a fair number of smallholder farmers around outside of Nairobi. So maybe, and it's somebody like this weird person who you've never met before, who is from a different country, comes and says, hey, I want to give you some money. Like, if I really put myself in the shoes of this person, that seems like a pretty weird thing to do. And in fact, like, it's happened to me where I received an email saying, this is going to sound like a humble brag, and I guess it is, you know, I was nominated for some award, and I don't remember ever preparing the nomination. And my first impulse was like, what is this? Like, is there some sort of agenda? Like, why am I being contacted about this? It doesn't make any sense, because I didn't have the proper context. I didn't remember establishing any sort of relationship that would prepare me to understand why I was getting the nomination. Well, I think the same thing is happening here. So this person has maybe never, has never interacted with researchers before. And suddenly this weird person from a different country is saying, hey, I want to give you some cash. Like, maybe the first thing that they're thinking is, like, am I on the hook for something? Am I going to be expected to do something? Am I obligating myself to something? That, to me, is a very understandable line of thought. And I think that's behind this comment about the Illuminati. If you spend time in development-oriented organizations, you will hear stories and or experience this yourself, where there's someone makes a comment about the Illuminati. And I think the thing behind that is this power difference and difference in outlook and worldview that I commented on before. The funding structure also creates an organizational problem for the Busara Center. And that has to do with the fact that we're often working with clients who have their own priorities and or want to use us as an implementer, essentially. And that is that if there are things that we want to do because we think that they're important, and I mentioned that is the whole purpose of my group, is to do things that we want to do, that does not work very well with the funding model that yields the best success rate for the Busara Center. And that means that we're back in this bind of, trying to justify that we have excellent PIs, that our specific projects fit within the mission of the organizations that we're working with. We kind of have to thread this very difficult needle of spinning our priorities in a way that works for the funders that we're trying to get the resources from. And that is quite hard. This is a problem that Busara is still working on. I'm not the only person who's working on it, but certainly my team encounters it pretty frequently. And that's that if we have priorities that we think are important, remember that we're a nonprofit headquartered in Nairobi. The majority of our employees are Kenyan, and from other parts of the global south as well. And yet, we're finding it hard, despite having been around for a while, to express our own voice through our work. And I would argue that this is a problem that stems ultimately from the structure of scientific funding. Okay, I covered a lot of ground. Let me see if I can wrap up. I have advanced the argument that our funding system is optimized for funders, ultimately, who have a set of priorities that often focus on specific projects and or superstar PIs who, sort of the funder ends up getting to bask in the reflected glory of those star PIs. I would also argue that our funding system creates waste and ethical risks. I described the waste in the first section. It also expresses itself in the amount of time that organizations like the PSA and the Busara Center spend on justifying that their activities fit the priorities of the funders. And the ethical risks are things like placing an inappropriate burden on early career researchers in the case of the PSA, creating this volunteer system that ends up selecting for people in the global north, as particularly at research active institutions. And at the Busara Center, it creates things like, social harms that are created by this big boundary that separates the funders who are calling a lot of the shots and the intended beneficiaries of their programs. And finally, I would argue that the funding system discourages things like innovation and voice. Innovation in the form of organizations that are trying to do something different, that are thinking outside of the box, like the Psychological Science Accelerator and the Busara Center, and voice in the form of making it hard for the PSA to select projects democratically and for the Busara Center to do things that it wants to do instead of things that its partners wanted to do. Thanks very much. I've got some extra slides in case they come up during questions, but I'm eager to hear what you all think, and I'm happy to answer any questions that come up.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Patrick. That was a great talk. Really interesting to hear your work for Busara. I was kind of wondering, I haven't seen you on Twitter and everything. I was wondering what exactly Busara was and some of the work that you did. So that was really, really good. Yeah. I guess like you were talking about the funding landscape, and I agree with all of those kind of points that you mentioned in terms of the problems. Have you got any some ideas of kind of how we can solve this? Any kind of solutions that we might have?
Yeah, I think the funding priorities need to shift. So the title of the talk is Science Should Value Capacity Building. My argument is that instead of focusing on projects that fit a certain set of priorities that are dictated by funders, we should be investing in organizations like Busara and the Psychological Science Accelerator and many other organizations, frankly, that are building tools to enable people sometimes in places like Kenya to do great science. Instead of it being a top-down structure, I think it's good for funders to make investments and to try to spend money wisely. But I think spending money wisely here means not selecting specific projects through competitive peer review or even dictating what the project is, but instead investing in tools that empower people, scientists, to do great science.
Great, yeah. It's tough, isn't it? We have to influence the funders and get them to kind of change the way they work, I suppose. But yeah.
Yeah, well, here I am, making this argument. I've made it in other places. If we are not voiceless here, funders do listen to researchers. You can get meetings with them, and if you're persuaded by these arguments, you can make them too. Yeah. So we are not powerless, even though we have less power. The power of the purse is strong. There is power in making arguments, persuasion, talking with the decision makers who are pulling those purse strings and saying, hey, I think we should be investing in this capacity building project. And sometimes those projects are close to home. So, my examples were in, one of my examples was in Kenya. And I do think there needs to be a lot more research or investment in Kenya. So there's an audit that I like to cite that says, or that basically surveyed a bunch of top psychology journals, and it found that less than 1% of research samples in these journals were African, and less than 1% of PIs on the projects were African. So there's a lot that we can do on that. But, some of the investments can be closer to home. So one form of infrastructure, for example, is software. So if you're an R user like me, you end up relying on a lot of packages that are often built by single people. There's a project that just surveyed a bunch of open source projects, and it found that the modal number of developers on open source projects was 1. These are projects that are driven often by volunteers who just do it because they think it's a nice thing to do. Sounds a lot like the Psychological Science Accelerator or the SIPS projects, whatever. There's a very strong commonality. Those projects are, they're done by workaday researchers at universities like where you're at, and those projects deserve support, whether it be financial or, frankly, you could even make some strides in just like, citing the software packages, because this is often the major research output of the people who are doing the heavy development work. And if they're an academic, they're going to benefit from those citations just like you do. So there are smaller steps that we can take. The basic issue here is that we, and I'm using the collective we here, should value the capacity building activities that are already taking place that create our research infrastructure that make great science possible. And here I'm using the collective we, not just to make, not just singling out funders. The collective we severely undervalues those capacity building activities, I would argue. And one of the manifestations of those is the fact that, the research administration jobs, that's a form of research capacity. I mentioned how project monitors within the PSA do all of these things. That's an administrator job, essentially. And yeah, project management, I've never seen a single call for a new faculty member that mentioned project management skill as a valued skill. That's a problem. That's reflecting, I would argue, this lack of value that we place on the things that help our research be better. Likewise, I can't remember, I don't know of a single department that has a class on project management. That's, again, I would argue, reflecting this lack of value put on capacity. So yes, I think there are things that we can do closer to home, even though the thrust of the talk was mostly aimed at funders, because I think they play a huge role here.
Yeah, absolutely. How about for the PSA, like you talked about the massive kind of author list, and you talked a little bit around kind of how democratic the kind of processes are in terms of the roles and everything, but just like from a very practical viewpoint, like how do you decide kind of things like the author order, because somebody has to be first, and there's still, unfortunately, a certain cachet about kind of first author and who gets last author, and some people are kind of concerned about that. Okay, less so in the open science community, but it's still part of some of the metrics by which we're judged in our jobs. So I was just wondering, like, how you go about deciding those kind of questions around order and contribution.
Yeah, great question. So there are two parts to this answer. The PSA does have set policies about authorship order, or rather it has guidelines. The specific authorship order is worked out per project, and it's agreed to in advance through a collaboration agreement that helps adjudicate or prevent really hurt feelings related to authorship order. The second part is we're trying to push against this common emphasis on authorship order by using something called contributorship, which involves just listing what people did in the author notes. And we archive that information on OSF pages as well. And we try to emphasize that in how we talk about our work, and to try to persuade people really that this is the right way to go. So the PSA also tries to shift the incentives, because I agree the traditional authorship order as it's structured poses a long-term sustainability threat to PSA labor, in that the person who's really the most incentivized is just one person, and that's entirely counter to this idea of massive collaboration. So we try to prioritize that and emphasize it in our internal communication and our external communication, and advocate for contributorship systems where we can. If you look at PSA papers, you'll find those contributions listed at the end. We also try to, basically emphasize the contributions of people who are typically neglected, like the project monitors. If you look at the PSA blog, you'll find some posts that just talk about this very problem and that call out specific people for acknowledgement. So there's two parts. One, we try to use this collaboration agreement that I mentioned that prevents hard feelings. And the second is we actively advocate for alternative systems involving contributorship that we think will have benefits for the scientific ecosystem.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, I think the kind of contributor kind of statements are massive, but I think there's also a case for, I guess, kind of an open and fair process by which people can apply to do the certain jobs and the certain roles and to make the contribution that they want to as well. So it's another part to it. But I think we'll leave it there, Patrick. That was excellent, and thanks so much for agreeing to give the talk today. And we'll see this talk on YouTube. So thanks very much again, Patrick. Excellent stuff.
Oh, thanks so much for having me.
Great.